Hello everyone and welcome to Positivity, your weekly celebration of all things book related. This is a brand new channel where I'll be discussing books from all manner of backgrounds, authors and origins. January is a really exciting time for booksellers, reviewers, bloggers and everyone who loves books because it's the time that people release their roundups for 2020 and books for 2021 lists, which you can find all over the internet right now. My reading this month has been quite heavily influenced by those. The book I'm starting with is Rodham by Curtis Sittenfeld, which came out in July last year. I've had my eye on this book for a really long time. Even the cover of this book is so striking. I've become a bit obsessed with Googling pictures of Hillary Rodham Clinton pre-Bill because she was so geeky chic. Set in an alternate timeline, it looks at the life of Hillary Rodham if, rather than marry Bill Clinton, their relationship had come to an end. Being British and not having that much knowledge of American politics, infidelity and affairs are the only aspects of Clinton's presidency that I have any awareness of. I wasn't familiar with any of his politics before I researched him whilst reading this novel. Hillary, I only knew as the woman who stood by her man and became quite a contentious figure in some circles for it. In this alternate fictional reality, the romantic relationship between Hillary and Bill is all wrapped up in the first 150 pages of a 415-page novel, but Bill remains this ghostly figure in the background of Hillary's professional life as she goes it alone into law and politics. Sittenfeld captures her, I wouldn't call it cold, but certainly committed approach towards her professional passions. There are some quite uncomfortable moments in the novel where the character totally miscalculates her actions. There's one point where Hillary decides to last minute enter the race to become senator in Chicago, and she becomes the second female candidate, the first being a black woman whose campaign isn't going well. Hillary decides to almost capitalise in on that, not considering at all the symbolism of her actions for the black community. There's a passage where she's having a conversation with a friend who is begging her not to run against the other woman because of the setback it will create for black women everywhere. And Hillary's approach is, well, she's not going to win anyway, so what's the problem? It's not about race. She approaches the situation completely statistically and logically without any acknowledgement of the symbolism of her actions, which I found to be a really uncomfortable moment. It's important to mention that Sittenfeld emphasises that this is a piece of fictional writing in the opening preface, but it still feels like lots of parallels can be drawn between this alternate reality and the figures of Bill and Hillary in our political memories. In this novel, Bill still enters politics, but his personal life creates issues. There's a passage where he and his fictional wife appear on TV following an affair accusation. But because his fictional wife takes a different approach to that which Hillary initially did in, for example, the Monica Lewinsky affair scandal and the questions around abuse of power that followed it, there's a different outcome for both that marriage and for Bill. It raises the question of how much Hillary Clinton Rodham sacrificed of herself in being First Lady. If she had become more emotional somehow and placed more blame at Bill's shoes rather than the other woman's, would she have been a more popular figure in American cultural memory? Jumping back to contemporary politics, Donald Trump makes an appearance. This novel spans a huge portion of Hillary's life and Trump becomes embroiled in the narrative in quite an unexpected way. The relationship between him and Hillary in this novel has been described by some reviewers as a shocker, especially given that in reality they ran against each other in the 2016 presidential election. Sittenfeld captures Trump's voice, vocabulary and sentence structure so well without it becoming too much of a parody, which is a hard thing to do. Overall, this novel is a slow burner. I wouldn't describe it as action-packed, and some reviewers have said it was slow, but I enjoyed the pauses for thought it created through that what could have possibly been concept. It feels like a literary version of the TV show House of Cards. I haven't read many books that are fictionalised accounts of people who are still alive. However, if you wanted to read a book with a similar focus on politics and real figures in history, Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall trilogy is a totally different time period and location, but shares the common theme of a real person being turned into fiction, as well as a very thorough political thread. I haven't read Mantell's short story collection, The Assassination of Margaret Thatcher, but with a more contemporary setting, that might be another good suggestion. It's a book that's on my TBR list. Moving on to my next book, a non-fiction must-read, The Covent Garden Ladies by Hallie Rubenhold. It's about the Harris List of Covent Garden Ladies, which was essentially a review of all the prostitutes working in 1750s London, collated and published initially by two men, John Harrison, who became Jack Harris, and Sam Derrick. These two are the focal point of this book. This book was first published in 2006, and it was republished in 2020 in this newspaper-style book cover, which now matches the front cover of her 2019 award-winning book, The Five. The Five is also an absolute must-read. It was a huge success in 2019 and won the Baillie Gifford Prize for Non-Fiction Writing. For those of you who missed it, The Five was written as a reclamation of the lives of the women killed by Jack the Ripper, whose identities Rubenhold felt had become lost in their affiliation with the strangely celebrated mystery of the Whitechapel mass murderer. Interestingly, in the new foreword included in this reissue of the Covent Garden Ladies, Rubenhold reflects upon this earlier book being too focused on the men who produced the list, rather than the lives of the women in it. Having now read the book, I think that's a pretty astute summary. It looks particularly closely at the lives of both Jack Harris and Sam Derrick, and one prostitute called Charlotte Hayes, who was hugely successful. She's referred to as an escort to reflect her higher social status. The normal women working on the streets are talked about as byproducts, really, to prop up the story of these main three. Their stories aren't expanded upon, aren't explored, and so in some respects this book feels like a celebration of the two men who monopolised on the number of women who turned to prostitution, many of whom were forced into it. The one woman who is expanded upon is born into high-class prostitution and eventually becomes a brothel owner herself, so again, not necessarily a representative picture of the experiences of being an average prostitute at this time. Rubenhold's foreword in this new edition brings a new perspective to the book, which can entirely change the way you look at it and approach it. Even if this book would be a reread for you, she's offered a new lens that would make it feel fresh. She's also such a visceral writer. You can hear and smell and feel the drudgery of 1750s Covent Garden as you read it. I just wish that detail had been applied to at least one normal woman working as a prostitute in Covent Garden at that time. I loved this book, but the characters she focused on did not feel representative of the realities of that life at that time. I recommend, once you have read this book, read The Five by Hallie Rubenhold to really see what she means about the limited narrative on women, because The Five is all about the women. Moving on to my next read, The Vanishing Half by Brit Bennett, which tells the story of twins growing up in a very small and stagnant town who want to expand their personal horizons. They run away as teenagers, and as they are trying to forge their own independence and identities, one of the twins passes racial identity to live as a white woman, initially as a means of getting a job, which identifying as black would not have afforded her. I hadn't really heard of the term passing before, but that's the word used by the characters to describe somebody who changes their identity in that way. To give some background to the upbringing of these girls, the sisters come from a town obsessed with being light-skinned. The novel spans many generations of the sisters' family, going all the way back to a former plantation slave who has experienced in its most brutal and ugly form the privileges that being light-skinned can afford a person. This tension bubbles throughout the town, especially between the different age groups, as the younger come to challenge their elders' predispositions. Eventually, this conflict seeps into the relationship between the twins, culminating in one completely altering their identity. I've not known a novel to dig into the psychology of identity structure, and particularly racial identity structure, in the way this novel does. There's a psychology theory of race identity and how living under the leadership of a government that doesn't represent your race or your racial identity can create an internal conflict called double consciousness, which was first coined by William Du Bois in the early 1900s. Essentially, when you are constantly being observed through a racist lens, it comes to shape the way you view yourself and your personal limitations according to the message society is giving you. Bennis is so successful at demonstrating that psychology in action here. And the beauty of the way it's written means that rather than the novel being hugely complicated and inaccessible, it's absolutely gripping. This book made me reassess my own privileges. I feel like I learnt a lot by reading this. On a similar note, I read The Mothers last year by Brit Bennett, which is also fantastic. It was very different in some aspects, but there is a similar focus on family loyalty and identity. It's about a teenage romantic relationship which results in a pregnancy and then a decision to have an abortion, which the father of the unborn baby was made completely oblivious to. That novel was a lot shorter than The Vanishing Half, but it also packed a huge punch. A book that The Vanishing Half reminded me of a huge amount was Silver Sparrow by Tayari Jones. Silver Sparrow is about two half-sisters who share the same father, who's a bigamist and tries to keep his two families separate. However, the daughter of his second wife becomes aware of the existence of her half-sister, and the novel is about how the relationship between the girls develops. Silver Sparrow is much slower in places than The Vanishing Half, but shares the same questions around how our identities are formed. Another that I would recommend if you enjoy The Vanishing Half is Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng. She also wrote Little Fires Everywhere, which was picked up by Reese Witherspoon's book club and turned into a TV series. Everything I Never Told You was her debut novel and looks at the experience of a Chinese-American girl trying to navigate high school and eventually college in the USA as the child of a migrant family. It explores how her identity feels split by the different pressures and expectations on her shoulders, culminating in her body being found in the local lake. That isn't a spoiler, by the way, it's mentioned on the blurb. It's another excellent choice if you enjoyed The Vanishing Half. The penultimate book I'm going to talk about is going to become a book I buy everybody for their birthdays for the next year. It's The Girl with the Louding Voice by Abi Dare. I absolutely adored this novel. It's set in Nigeria and is about a young girl called Aduni who is desperate to get an education and become a teacher herself. However, her family circumstances mean that her father sells her into a marriage with a much older man who already has two wives. This book was brilliant. It was funny and heartbreaking and inspiring all in equal measure, but also so incredibly readable. I devoured this book. I simply could not stop reading it. My favourite aspect is how Dare writes about the value and privileges of education. When I'm not reading and reviewing books, my normal job is a teacher, so maybe that's why the book struck such a chord with me. I've marked out a passage in the book that I'm going to be sharing with my pupils about education and the power that it affords a person. What I liked about Dare's celebration of schooling through her character of Aduni is that the end goal is simply having a voice, hence the title The Girl with the Louding Voice, because that is all Aduni is wanting, a confidence and a metaphorical platform upon which to represent people like her. More widely, the majority of this cast of characters are women and girls. As well as celebrating education, the book also celebrates the strength of women, especially women living in parts of the world where their voices are not as loudly heard. And the characters that she builds in conveying this message are so visceral. One of the most intriguing characters for me was Big Madam. A lot of the time is spent exploring how Big Madam ends up being the way she is and how her family structure has restructured her to a certain extent. I haven't read anything else quite like The Girl with the Louding Voice. There were parts of it that reminded me of writing by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie in its vivid and passionate descriptions of Nigeria, especially the capital of Lagos. Equally, it reminded me of the non-fiction book Educated by Tara Westover, which is Tara's memoir of growing up in a household that didn't value formal education and how she overcame that family dynamic to eventually earn her PhD. It's the kind of book that, like I said, I'll be getting everybody, I know, for their birthdays, because no matter what kind of reader you are, there is so much value to be gained by reading this novel. I don't do stars, but 5 million stars for this book. The final book I'm going to be talking about in this video is Bridget Collins' second novel, The Betrayals. I read Bridget's first book, The Binding, relatively soon after it came out and was immediately taken by its whimsical fantasy setting. Reading The Betrayals has been a similar experience, although the plots and combinations of different narratives in this novel is far more ambitious than that of The Binding. There are 4 voices in this novel that take on alternate chapters. The story follows the relationship between Leo and Claire, who have become reacquainted with one another at a magical school for studying, the Grand Jeu. Claire is a controversial figure at the school because she is one of the magisterium, as well as being a female teacher in an all-boy institution. Meanwhile, Leo is a former pupil who has returned after being banished from his government position. There is lots going on in this novel. It's fantasy, there's magic, a mysterious whodunit plot, a queer romance, heretical politics, and a hint of totalitarianism that Claire in particular is fighting to overhaul. It is a busy and ambitious novel that can feel like too much at points. But for fans of novels like The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman, or maybe those of you who are still awaiting the third and final part of the Name of the Wind series by Patrick Rothfuss, this is a book that I think you might enjoy. So that wraps up my reads for January so far. Join me next time where I will be discussing my TBR for the rest of the month and into February. Let me know what you thought of the books discussed in this video and whether there are any recommendations that you would make for me. Add them into the comment section below. Speak soon. I wouldn't call it cold, but certainly committed approach towards her professional passions. Overall, this novel is a slow burner. So again, not necessarily representative of the picture that these women, which was first coined by William Dubois in the early 1990s.